Action. Okay, good morning. What is wrong with you people? Good morning.
Good morning.
Good, we need some energy. Thank you very much for the invitation. Harman, to Sandra, David, the DARE team, Caroline, Emil, thank you so much for inviting me. What I want to do is just to share some of my thinking. I want to talk a lot today about why we do global education, or in my own term, global youth work. But also, I want to talk about how we do it. So these are the two main things I'm going to try to address today. So we will also try to look at this within globalization and global inequality, because I think that's a very fundamental aspect of why and how we do what we do. I also want us to situate global education, because when we do global education, for a lot of people, it's like getting young people, talking to them, raising awareness. But how does this fit in? How do we situate this in the story, the narrative of human development and sense view about capabilities? Because how do we develop people's capacity, their agency, to be able to do things for themselves, and not just to do all of this fancy stuff about, yes, we're actually engaged and wearing our fashion accessory to show that we are actually quite cool people who do think about other stuff that's outside of our country. How do we really engage the people that we engage with, but how do we also build their capacity? I think that's really, really important. But also, I want to link that into what are the values, what are the frames that inform the decision that we make. Because for me, ultimately, global education, global youth work must do two things. It must, one, provoke consciousness, critical consciousness, and two, it must also support people to take action. So for me, these are the two key elements of global education, global youth work. But I'll go deep into it later on. I will also want to make sure that we talk about this thing about campaign and, okay, so. Okay, there's a lot of talks about campaign and how campaigning, a lot of what the charities do, a lot of what the NGOs do, and global education. Is it the same? When we do all that charity appeal, when we talk about all of those poor people, when we talk about the suffering, is that really global education? Or is there a difference? And I want to explore that in a very, very critical way. And that's something I want to do throughout my talk. I want us to look in the mirror. Like, if we look at, I think each of you come from different localities. And I'm sure all the people watching as well have got different localities. And I want you to think about, when you look at the mirror, when you look within your society, what are the issues? I can tell you about all of these things. People who live on less than $1 a day. I can tell you about hunger. I can tell you about child deaths in sub-Saharan Africa, in Southern Asia. I can talk to you about child mortality. I can tell you about people who don't have access to drinking water. I can tell you about people who are dying from malaria. I can talk about emissions. I can tell you about all these problems that exist in the world. But what are the realities? What are your local realities? What are the issues? And I want you to reflect. I want you to look at the mirror. I want you to think about what are the issues that affect Italy. What are the issues that affect Bulgaria? Well, in the UK, we talk about Brexit. I told somebody I was going to speak, and he told me not to speak about Brexit. So, I'm going to try not to talk about Brexit today. But obviously, it is a big issue that has a massive implication, not only for the UK, but also for Europe as well. And we hope that the wise people in Parliament in the UK and the wise people in the European Parliament and the European Commission find a way of making this work. But that aside, let's think about the issues. What are the issues that confront us in our daily realities? I know Italy, until recently, we had all of these unemployment issues, but we also had the migrants, which actually I'll be talking about later, whether it was in Lampedusa or all of these places from Libya through the Parkway, which has a massive implication. And we did some really interesting project about that I would like to share. But fundamentally, the point I want to make is that we live in a fractured world that is fraught with greed, that is fraught with inequality and poverty and suffering. And whatever we do, for me, global education must try to address those issues. And I will talk more about that as we go on. And then we can talk about, if we live in a fractured world that has so many problems, how do we actually kind of like make it better? I mean, I like this UNP definition that about development, and said human development particularly is the expansion of people's freedoms to live long, healthy, and creative lives, to advance other goals they have reason to value, and to engage actively in shaping development equitably and sustainably on a shared planet. People are both the beneficiaries and the drivers of human development as individuals, as in groups. I think I often ask myself, apart from the fact that global education, global youth work is a fashion accessory that makes me look cool, what else does it do? If I'm working with young people, if I'm engaging with communities, what is it I'm trying to do? And for me, this notion of development and human development is something that I always come back to, because ultimately I want to make a difference. I want to make a difference in the quality of people's lives. But what does advancement look like? What does development look like? How do we improve the values? How do we improve the lives of people? And I think that's quite important, and I always want to come back to this as well. I mean, obviously, you had all of these stories from a long time ago about what development has done or what development hasn't done. I like Sachs' quote, that the idea of development stands like a ruin in the intellectual landscape. Delusion and disappointment, failures and crimes have been the steady companions of development, and they tell a common story. It did not work. So when we talk about development, from whose perspective? Who is it working for? And we are in positions where we try to bring awareness, to provoke consciousness, to engage in bringing about change. But does it work? Or is it like I often say to some of my students, that we're engaged in doing massive public masturbation and we feel good about it? But what effect does it have on the people we work with, on the changes that we're trying to bring along? I mean, obviously, Escobar's view as well is also quite important. Again, there are counter views, like Zaid, who believe that these people are just talking out of their elbows and don't really know what they're talking about. So development in itself is a site of contestation. Am I speaking very fast?
No.
No? Are you getting me loud and clear?
Yes.
Okay. If you're totally with me and you understand me, can you put your right hand up, please? Can you wave it from side to side? Like you don't care? Okay, you can. Good. But again, we talk about human development, yeah? We talk about human development here. And human development, I like, because ultimately, global educators, global practitioners are extremely strategic people. They've got great vision, but they also reflect on action and inaction. They're thinking about things, and as they're thinking about things, they're also making the changes as it is happening live. That takes great strategy, and that takes great intelligence. But when we're doing all this kind of stuff, what is the ultimate goal of what we're doing? And for me, human development and sense view are quite important in that they talk in the UNDP reports about human development. And I think the approach makes a shift from the economy to human beings as a center of intervention, rather than talking about GDP or the whatever it is that we talk about, money and income. It's got to be expanded to improve other elements around schooling, around quality of life, around health, which actually has a more holistic approach to development. And I want us to focus on that before I come and talk about global education. But also, what is important as well in that was that Nussbaum and Sen have moved the approach from just, just the money aspect of it to something about human well-being, standard of living, which actually supersede other per capita income. And because when we talk about inequality, we can talk about between country inequality and within country inequality. Between country inequality is the inequality that exists between different countries, but within country inequality is the inequality that exists between one demographic of the country and another. So you can have a country with a massive GDP per capita, whatever you want to call it. But when you look at the disparity, the gap between the rich and the poor, the haves and the have-not, it's so massive that this is masked. And that's why, for me, we need to move more towards the capability approach. Again, when we talk about capability, when we talk about building capacity, when we talk about trying to make a difference, when we talk about building the agency of people, Sen argues that this needs to be negotiated democratically, and people need to be at the center of making these choices, of choosing what these capabilities are. But obviously, Nussbaum believes that, actually, we can actually postulate some views. We can actually kind of like share some of those things. And she shared these 10 bits, that there is one to life, bodily health, bodily integrity, senses, imagination and thought, emotions, practical reasons, affiliation, other species, play, control over one's environment. So basically, if you're talking about development, is this what development should look like? When you have all of these things, are we then developed? Is that what we look for? Because how do we, if we talk about all of this, it's about we're going to develop people, we're going to improve people's lives, we're going to make the changes. What is it that we're trying to do? Are you with Sen that we need to negotiate with the people that we work with so that they and us can negotiate what we're trying to do with them and what development would look like? Or are we with Nussbaum, who said, actually, the right to life? It's very interesting because one of my favorite things is the former president, one of the former presidents of Senegal, Senghor, said that human rights begins after breakfast. So if you don't have breakfast, then you cannot talk about human rights because you need to talk about the right to eat and to stay, So it's very, very important and how we negotiate these things, because we're working with a lot of young people. I mean, for some people, when they do global education, global youth work, global learning, it's about, do you know about the number of children starving in Africa? Do you know about how many things we export there? Do we know about these things? But it's not only about those people. It's about the interconnectedness, because globalization means that time and space and distance have been conquered. And what's happening here, it's actually impacting and affecting simultaneously what is happening in other parts of the world. You can talk about the war in Syria. It's got a massive impact on Europe and America and what's happening here. We talk about the economic policies or lack of it thereof. For every £1 that goes into Africa, we're talking about 13 pounds coming out of Africa to service that. And who benefits from that? If we talk about IMF, World Bank, in some places in Africa, they've got as much as a 75% failure rate. And those policies have an impact because the young people who are migrating at all costs through the back way into Spain, into Europe, into Italy, sometimes do that as a result of the policies that are in place. So we talk about almost structural violence because of the structures that exist that actually make these things happen. So there is a symbiosis. There is a kind of like interconnectedness that link one part of the world to the other. And obviously we can link this to the Sustainable Development Goals, which I'm sure most of you are working through. And the global body has done a good job of talking about all of these goals, which we can try to work towards. But can you link that to the capabilities approach? Can you link that to development? Can you link that to outcomes when you talk about global education, global learning, and global youth work? And I will keep on coming back to this. And again, whilst we're talking about this, it's very, very important that we talk about agency. When we talk about agency, what do we mean by agency? Again, Dan Todd and Clark said that they believe that it is a person's belief that they are able to undertake an action to tackle poverty and that action will have the desired effect. Not only the thought, but also for me, it's about the ability. Yeah? So when we work with young people, when we work with communities around global education, around global development, do we recognize their agency? Do we recognize their ability, their capacity to make these changes happen? To recognize what their problems are? I think that's quite important for me. And again, values and frames, because when we talk about campaigning, it's a lot of recruiting people so that they could support a particular cause, so that we could raise the money, so that we can have the visibility and the publicity. But when we talk about global education, I think it goes deeper than that. It's also about how people gain, in Paulo Freirean terms, that critical consciousness that allows them. You know, Paulo talks a lot about us being seduced by a defective logic of the system. And that logic tells us what is right and wrong and good and bad and just and unjust. And then these are the ways in which we construct reality. Somebody talks about human meaning making. Yeah? But I think here, the frames that we see reality through and the values that we position ourselves from are quite important, because global education is a simple but very complex thing. Because if we're engaging in it to actually bring about change, to bring about the way that people see the world and therefore the way in which they interact with the world, then we need to understand the values and the frames that they use to, one, make sense of the world, to conceptualize, but also how we then actually take action as a result of that. And again, they said that values, the guiding principles that individuals use to judge situations and determine their courses of action, whilst the frames would be the chunks of factual and procedural knowledge in the mind with which we understand situations, ideas, and discourses in everyday life. So part of the way is that we have to get people to invite us in their lives. How do we get people to invite us in their lives so that we can see the way that they see the world, in order to get them to change the way that they see the world, in order to change the way that they act with the world? So how do we understand their values? How do we understand their frames? I think that's a very, very important part. Are you still with me?
Yeah.
Am I making sense? You will tell me if I'm not.
Yeah.
Okay, good. Again, we can look at, for example, a theoretical model here. I don't know how, can you see it from there?
Yeah.
But the theoretical model, you can see when we work with young people, when we work with communities, where are we, yeah? In terms of the openness, are they open to change? You know, is it around self-enhancement? Is it around self-transcendence? Is it about a conservative approach to life, to situations? And what are the various things that motivate them? You know, are they motivated by power, by security, by tradition, by trying to conform, by benevolence, universalism, self-direction, stimulation? So what is it within the quadrants that actually motivates them? You know, and I think that's important, because if we're going to try to get them to invite us in their lives, and then get to understand how they see the world, then we have to understand how they make meaning out of their situations. Yeah. But again, another one here is very, very simple. Another model that's very, very simple in terms of, are we more focused on self-transcendence or physical self or extrinsic self or intrinsic self? And are you more, let's say, spiritual self-transcendence? Doing things, because why would people change the way they act? If you're telling them that they need to be global citizens, they need to be engaged in this and that, why would they change it? Is it because they're more interested in the spiritual and the community and intrinsic, and it's about how they go beyond themselves and service? Or are they more around conformity, in which case, how do you move them? Is it more around, you know, the physical self and all of these things about hedonism and seeking pleasure and all that kind of stuff? Or is it more about the image? What is it that motivates people? Because what we're doing is very complex science. Some people say, oh, you as youth workers, as global educators, you just play table tennis and pool with the young people and you think you're changing the world. But we're doing something deeper than that, something more complex than that and more complicated than that. And we need to understand that what we're doing has got theory around it. And we have to think about it very, 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 very deeply in order to bring about those changes. I mean, obviously, we can talk about Oxfam. I think they've updated it, but what are their issue of global citizenship, and what are the key elements in terms of knowledge and understanding, in terms of skills, in terms of values and attitudes? What are we trying to do in terms of these changes that we're trying to bring along? You know, so are we talking about knowledge of social justice and equity, diversity, globalization and interdependence, sustainable development, peace and conflict? What about the skills? What are we trying to engender there? What about the values and the attitudes that we're trying to change as well? And again, they're very clear in terms of what global citizenship is. You know, but for me, the thing that actually gets me is this one, that a global citizen is somebody who is outraged by social injustice. And maybe we just want to live a peaceful life, eat our pizza, drink our beer, go to bed. But also, I like to play around with this, you know, it's nothing to do with a scientific theory of relativity, but I want to play around with this idea of relative distance, which simply means that if you got shit, if you got somebody defecated, the closer you are to the defecation, to the shit, the more it smells. The farther you are away from the shit, the less like it's there to smell. If you are in the entrenched situation of the battlefield, then you are actually affected. The shit is smellier. But when you're away from the whole situation, then the shit is actually farther away from you. So I think it's important that we start to think about also how all of these things affect us. But also how when you're in the middle of things, when you're in the depth of things, you're affected, you're possibly more outraged than if you're away from it. Because you can look at it from a distance, you can look at it from tinted glasses, and you can look at it from the comfort of your sitting room and your TV, and you can forget about these situations tomorrow. But how, when you talk about those young people who are affected by the backway solutions, by the backway issue, and they've got no other solution but to actually go out to these places, what do we do about that? If we talk about the poverty that happens within our communities during the winter, what do we do about that? If you have to step over homeless people to go to your Christmas dinner, what do we do about that? If we talk about the interdependence of the world, the Syrian refugee, the crisis, you know, you can talk about Afghanistan, you can talk about all of these things. But more immediately, what kind of Europe are we building? What are our attitudes towards others? Muslims, for example. Where is the narrative coming from? I just want us to think about how, as global citizens, what happens in other parts of the world is significantly affecting what we're doing right here, right now. Okay. I've been told I've got 5 minutes, so I'll go through this. But also, I want you to think about campaigning, because I've worked with some of the biggest organizations in the aid field, and I've done training for their staff, like over a day or 2 days, and I've had great chance to interact with them. But I think I always come across this big obstacle where, when I talk about the work that they do, their educational work they do, it doesn't amount to anything more than campaigning. It's just about campaigning. And I think there is something about, you know, what Sida called pornography of poverty. And people call it imaging pornography as well, where you think about, I mean, here, I mean, Fine says it, the image of the starving African is said to edify us, sensitize us, mobilize our goodwill, and awaken us from our empathy. And again, Nathanson says that one cause of these perceptions may be fundraising messages that present distorted portrayals of the developing world, images of buzzing flies, begging eyes, and bloated bellies, flood television screens, and print media in an attempt to pull at the heartstrings and garner donations. So there's this imaging pornography. Like, if I give you a very horrible picture of a child in Nepal or in India or in Africa, then you're likely to put your hands in your pocket and actually donate. And obviously, this is good for the aid agencies because they actually get the money. Whether they actually do what they're supposed to do is another matter. But in the minds of the people, possibly in the hearts and the souls of the people, there is this imagery of these poor people. And then that becomes the dominant narrative. Because when we talk about construction of reality, we're talking about configurations of ways of knowing and ways of being. And this becomes the dominant ways in which we perceive of these people. But also our relationship with the other parts of the world is a very twisted one based on this dominant narrative. So campaigning can be about raising funds, which might have some impact and effects. But when you talk about the changes that could happen, I don't think that is global education. That is fundraising, yes. That is sensitization, yes. But that doesn't bring about the development and the capabilities that we talked about earlier. Yeah? So how do we actually separate campaign and global education? And I want us to think about, because I've got I think I've got about 4 sessions with you today. So I want you to start thinking about that as we go through the day. But for me, what we do as community workers, as global educators, is this. And I think I like Ledwin, who said that community development begins in the everyday reality of people's lives by extraordinarily re-experiencing the ordinary. It is a praxis that locates the silent stories of those who are marginalized and excluded at the heart of any theory of change for social justice. It's very important for me here, because whether it's happening in Africa or India or Asia or wherever, but also there are issues here. Global education, global youth work is not about only people out there. It's about here, right now, right here. And we need to understand, the nature of trade, of exploitation, of Brexit, of politics, of culture and its influence, of ISIS and Islamophobia and the war on terror and all of those things. These have got direct implications at the personal, local, national and global level. And we need, if some of the young people are being recruited to go and fight in other places, that has an impact on what we do. If people are coming from other places because of the wars that we've waged on those countries and places to come and live here and we protest against that, that has an implication of the interrelationship. So when we talk about how we extraordinarily experience the ordinary, I think it's very, very important that we think about it deeper. So global education. The Maastricht Global Education Declaration, that global education is education that opens people's eyes and minds to the realities of the globalized world and awakens them to bring about a world of greater justice, equity, and human rights for all. So for me, it's not only about opening people's eyes and minds, but it's also how we support them to take action, to make a difference. But I'm not talking about action that is tokenistic. I'm not talking about action that is rooted in this kind of like, let's save this poor soul, or around imaging pornography. I'm talking about action that is genuine, action that is based on critical consciousness, action that is based on the agency of the people that we work with. How do we provoke consciousness? In the next session, I'll talk more about the conceptual frameworks and how we can do this thing that we can call global education or global youth work. But we need to understand that what we do is deeper. It has to do with development. It has to do with human development. It has to do with globalization. It has to do with building capabilities and capacities. It's not just about us kind of like feeling good about, masturbating in public. It's deeper than that. It's about how we make change in the way that people see the world, but also in the way that they act with the world. I will take questions if you have them. Thank you very much. Okay. Can I sit down? Can I?
You
Questions?
can sit down.
Okay. No. Am I taking